Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessment. So, we're going to now start with EIA process segment, and in these lectures we will see logical step-by-step approach which are followed for EIA process. So, if you remember, we had previously seen in brief how is the EIA process like. So. We're going to look into details in this week on the EIA process part. So there can be many ways of doing EIA, and all these ways vary with the domain and context. So there might be variations, and not everybody would take all the steps. Not everything would be followed in all the countries. So we also saw that there's a lot of variations in legislation as well, and standards also as per the context, as per the countries. So similar way, you will also see that the processes also vary. So we will look at a very common practice of EIA process. So it might vary as per your country, so you read it, you also refer to your country process. So while looking at the EIA process, you may keep in mind that EIA process is not necessarily linear, one step at a time, but it can be cyclic also. So you move forward and then you come back, and then you have a feedback system, and then you again review things and move forward. So it can be cyclic system. So in this session, we'll look at the initial stage of EIA process, we had seen previously the 4 segments of it. So today we are going to look at the very first segments of the EIA process here. In this segment, we'll look at whether the project has to undergo EIA or not, and if the EIA has to be taken, what all should be covered under EIA. So in the initial stage, in many of the contexts, alternatives are also considered. So not only just screening, scoping, but alternatives are also considered. And then we also see that the baseline studies are undertaken, and then initial impact identifications are also done, like because of this project, the kind of project, what are the likely impact which might happen because of this particular proposed project. So this initial stage is a very important stage. It's an early stage, and it's important stage, and it reduces a lot of delay at the later part of the project, and it brings a lot of clarity. So this is an important stage. So today we are going to look at the initial stage and how this has to be taken care of. So accordingly, our coverage would include that in the EIA process, we'll look at the initial stage of EIA process, where we'll look at the various, we'll look at the aspect of management, we'll look at the screening process, we'll look at the scoping process and the baseline study, and then the initial impact identification. So we're going to look at the first box of the diagram which we saw. So accordingly, the learning outcome, expected learning outcome, is that after completion of this session, you should be able to synthesize the EIA process, you should be able to plan, organize your work, or understand what kind of process will take place, or organize your own EIA process here. So you should be able to synthesize all that, and then you should be able to discuss and explain all these aspects, the management aspect, the stage of screening, scoping, and baseline studies and impact identification after completion of this session. So looking at the management aspects of EIA process, the management is very important. So like you are seeing that there are so many sectoral variations, and then there are so many steps involved, and it varies a lot with context to context, and there are a lot of complex subjects which have to be dealt here. So EIA process needs considerable management because of all these kinds of range which it has, and then there can be conflicting or controversial impacts as well. So a good management is a must for EIA process. So while managing EIA, you will be required to determine the EIA team. So you might have to fix the EIA team for undertaking the EIA process. And you may note that the EIA process requires interdisciplinary teams. So you might have to bring in people from different domain and discipline to work together. And this bringing interdisciplinary teams allows you to have a complete perspective on different issues which are involved with the project. So team would mostly include like a very standard format for team would be team would mostly include proponents, the in-house team member, the person, the team which is proposing the project. Then you may have a lead external consultant to the project, and then also external sub-consultants, and then you will also have individual specialists, experts coming in, and then the team size can vary. It can be just few people to like 12 people, dozens of people working together. And then you also need to look at the skill set for the team, and then it should be that each member is able to undertake their task independently, and then also is able to communicate and work interdisciplinary manner as well. And you might also require additional input from experts in certain domain, like you might need people from landscape, you might need people from archaeology, air quality, traffic, and so on. Usually would finalize the team members after the scoping stage. So the team member would be done like once you know what kind of impact assessment has to be considered, what kind of detail has to be considered, what has to be left out. So based on that, you're going to decide your team members. You can have core team member, and then you can also have associated team, and then team manager has a very important role to play. And the team manager would handle like from selection of the team members to manage the specialists, to communicate with the project proponent, communicate with the stakeholders, public, and then how the participation has to be handled, the technique which would be used under it, and then would also look at the appropriate team and deal with typical personal issues as well, and then also manage how the inputs will come, specialist inputs will come, and also look at the schedule, that whether the EIA is happening as per the time schedule. And then one needs to also see that the focus is maintained in the EIA process, and then the entire report, because you'll have segments in which people will be working, so how the report is dealt in a coherent and robust manner. And then one needs to coordinate between the teams and also look at the documentary outputs which are required. So this was about the management aspect, and then one also needs to know different style of EIA process. So one needs to know that how the data would be handled and how the findings will be communicated, and you have and these things change with different projects, the nature of projects, and depending on what context you are dealing with. So if you're dealing with a populated context, then your EIA would be of a different nature, and when you're dealing in a barren land or an uninhabited land, then your approach would be different. So there are different, like as per the textbook given here, you find certain style of EIA report. So certain are like very rigorous, very intensive, systematic and intensive EIA process is desirable. and especially when you have to undertake scientific analysis to support the what kind of decisions is being made. And then you can also have a rational, like balanced process can be adopted, where you have stakeholders which are not participating under pressure or certain kind of influence, but participating in a free manner, so a balanced approach can be taken. Then you can also have a streamlined or a rapid approach, so where resources are limited and you have less data available, so you cannot really undertake scientific approach and you have limited resources, so you can have a rapid or a streamlined assessment. Then you can also, the other style which we see is the democratic EIA process, and it is said to work best when the proponents, the project developers, are willing to assign representatives for decision making authorities, and so that person has like enough time and is free from all other kind of influences. So that way is the democratic EIA process is adopted. And then you can also have collaborative EIA process, very similar to democratic process, but with stakeholders being directly engaged in the process and having the resources to do so. So they themselves, they are not just being the participants, but they are part of the process itself. Then you also have ethical EIA process, where there are issues about equity, justice, and so on. So you have then the ethical process can be also a style can be adopted. Then you have adaptive EIA process, and it is appropriate when you have a disturbed or a complex situation where risk, uncertainty, health, predominance are there. So according to that, you'll have an adaptive EIA process. So that was about different styles of EIA process. So EIA cost and resources also needs to be seen. So EIA team and style will affect or will be influenced by the cost and the resources you have. So cost of the study is taken care by the developer. So whatever EIA is prepared, so the proponent, the developer of the project, takes care of it, and the cost of the review, while the review is done, is taken by the authority, whichever is the reviewing authority as per the legislation. And if you look at the cost of, like everyone must be wondering what as a learner, like what kind of fees they would expect. So the cost of carrying out EIA tend to range from several thousands to several $1 million, from 0.01% to 1% of the capital cost of the project. So it might range in percentage of the proposed project, the cost of the capital cost of the project. And in certain cases where the problems are, there are a lot of problems and there's a problematic project, then the cost might even exceed 1%, the cost of undertaking EIA. So looking at the time aspects of how much time an EIA report takes, it takes between 6 months to 18 months to carry out the EIA part. And it is said that if you have a good initial stages of scoping and other things, so it really reduces your later time consumption. And so that is all about the management aspect. So now looking at the project screening part. So now we'll move to another segment. So that was about the management aspect. So we'll look at the screening part. So looking at the first box here, project screening. So here we decide whether the EIA is needed or not. So at the screening stage, we focus on those projects which have known substantial impact. So we don't really take into considerations of the projects of which we know that they do not have substantial impact. We consider only those projects which have known substantial impact, or in some cases they also consider projects about whose impact we are unaware of. So it's not known, so you might like to test it or like to check those. So the projects which have insignificant impact are screened out and are allowed to proceed to the normal planning permission, so they can go in the normal process, so they need not worry about preparing the EIA statement and so on. So we see that some countries at screening stage itself, as per their legislation or the procedural requirements, they ask for like full EIA at the level of screening itself, or they can just ask the outline draft of EIA. So in this EIA also we see two main approach for screening: the use of threshold, where they have threshold values, placing projects in categories and setting thresholds for each project type. So these may relate, for example, to project scale, like you can have project scale of certain square meter, and you can have anticipated impact in whatever quantities you take and where project locations are. So based on the scale of the project, nature of the impact, and where it is located, you have certain threshold rates which are given. So like we do in India, we have a list where we have category A and B, and you can see that how in each range of projects are given, and the scale is also given, and for which projects we might do the screening. So all those are given. Likewise, you can see European Commission EIA directive provides a list of projects in their schedule that that always requires full assessment by virtue of their, because of their scale and kind of environmental impacts. So those ranges you can see here what all have been given. You may also see that countries also do case by case screening. So case by case screening involves like in where countries do case by case screening, there they evaluate the characteristic of the project, and they submit for screening against checklist of the as per the criteria. So you see that European Union has published guidance to help how to undertake case by case screening process. So you can also look at those guidelines. And then many a times the screening approach, what approach you will take, is also determined by the legislation. So for example, you can see California Environmental Quality Act has specified in their act itself, like if there is substantial evidence in light of whole record before the lead agency that a project may have a significant effect on the environment. Such kind of writings are given there. So according to that, it is required by the legislation to undertake the screening and what kind of approach they would adopt. So this is an example of case by case approach. So you see that you have threshold level, and then case by case, threshold level, list level, and then you have case by case. So both the methods have advantages and limitations. We also find hybrid approach also. For example, indicative threshold used in combination with flexible case by case approach. So just quickly reviewing what are the advantages and disadvantages. So we look at the threshold type. So the advantage of this is that it's very simple to use, and then it saves a lot of time, and it also saves you from a lot of uncertainty. And then it is consistent between locations, consistent between decisions, and consistent between project types. So these are very good advantages of adopting threshold approach for screening purpose. But we also see there are certain disadvantages, like place arbitrary inflexible rules on variables, like what other aspect might be, and it might become inconsistent, like depending on the receiver's capacity. Difficult to set and onset, difficult to change the list, and it also leads to proliferation of the project lying just below the threshold. So like a lot of projects which might come, which may just touch the border case and would escape the entire EIA process. So now we look at the advantage of case by case screening approach. So it allows common sense and good judgment. So it allows you to check all the things, all the aspects of a project, and then it's flexible, can incorporate variety in the project and environment. So it allows you to look at the newer project or a project which might otherwise escape the list. But the disadvantage of this is that it is likely to be very complex and ambiguous, and which might lead to a lot of legal complication, and then likely to be slow as well as costly. And even this can be abused by the decision makers because of the political or financial interest involved. So, and it might be open to poor judgment of the decision makers, and there can be like variations in the decisions as well. So there are disadvantages to this. So we also see like inclusion lists. Likewise, you also have exclusion lists, where you have like what kind of projects which do not, it's known that these projects do not have significant environmental impact, so they can be added in the exclusion list. So that was about the screening process, and you see that screening process has its own benefit. So once the screening is done, it allows the project to improve on their own. So it is also said to be self-regulating. So when people see the screening option, then they might modify the scale of it, might modify the nature of it, or might modify the location of it. So it's said to be self-regulating. Now moving on, we'll look at to the second point that is considered in the process, that is scoping part. So at the scoping stage, you decide which impacts and issues are to be considered. So what all has to be included, what impact you will study, which impacts you will not study, depending on the nature of the project. And it is said to be very effective in the long run, because it allows you to save time and allows you to use your resources very efficiently if you decide and if you plan it out well. So the initial scoping of possible impact may identify those impact thought to be potentially significant. So you will be able to identify those, and then in this stage, you will decide what kind of further in-depth studies have to be undertaken, and you would eliminate what kind of things are not required. So unnecessary assessment or data collection would not be undertaken in this, and you will have the refined outcome here. And if you see, the scoping is generally carried out through discussions between the developers and then also the local planning authority and then the other relevant agencies and public. And it is often the first stage where you start the negotiation and consultation process. And this is also considered as an important step in EIA, because it allows you to make best use of your resources and allocate resources for identifying the key aspects of environment here. So you can also have impact identification techniques used for scoping purpose also, and at this stage environmental attributes that are particularly valued should be identified. So when you undertake scoping, you need to ensure that there might be environmental attributes which might be of importance to the people who are being affected or in the range of the project. And then all the affected parties, if they have any particular concerns, those things should be included here. And then you should also take care of the methodology which you will be using here, and then the scale at which those impact should be considered. So whether what radius you will be taking, what boundaries you will be taking for impact assessment. So how you will delineate your study area, and then and then you would also look at what kind of alternatives you will look at. So how many alternatives you look at, and what kind of possible alternatives you should look at. And then the outcome of the scoping should help you to identify key issues which have to be covered, and then also identify impacts, and then also impacts of the alternatives. And then you should be able to have explanation of why other issues are not considered significantly. So why you have taken certain sets of issues and why you have not taken other sets of issues. So you need to have explanation for those purpose, for those decisions you make. And And you also need to give justification for the key impacts which you have identified, and then justification for what time period you will take, what spatial boundaries you will take. So all these will be identified at this stage. So this is the example of one of these brief of this scoping report. So you can see how the socioeconomic impact, what they are going to undertake there, archaeology, what they are going to undertake, geology and hydrology, what they will cover, ecological impact and biodiversity, cumulative impact and assessment of alternatives. So what all areas they would consider and which they would not consider. So you see that scoping is an important step. However, it's not legally required in, like you can see, it's not legally required in Europe, but undertaking that improves the EIA outcomes. So your results are better whenever you take. And some countries like Canada and Netherlands have a formal scoping stage. So they have it by legislation, and in which the developers agrees with the competent authority to conduct the EIA. And we see in India, we have terms of reference, TOR is used for scoping purpose. So either the TOR is provided by the ministry or the usual TOR are also available for reference. So case by case TOR is either provided or the declared TORs are used for EIA purpose. So you can see here you have TOR for scoping purpose. So how this has been given for each, you can see that it has been given for each sector, 10 sector manual. You can see here that it has been given sector wise. Terms of reference, our usual terms of reference are given for each sector in our country. So how to undertake, what areas to be covered, what areas not to be covered for that particular sector is given in the manual. Then further you find European Union has published a detailed scoping checklist. You also see Environmental Agency has developed EIA guidance for particular types of projects. So that was about the scoping parts. Now you look at the how do we look at the alternatives. So how many alternatives will be considered, what has to be considered. So that can be like you can consider many alternatives. So what's really enough, and what kind of, how do you really choose to discuss more and to evaluate more. So the US Council for Environmental Quality it calls the discussion of alternatives as very important part of environmental impact statement. So in EIA you look at various alternatives to see that whatever decisions are made at its best. It is not it is not assured that the selected alternative is the best alternative, but it gives you the optimized approach to the particular problem and problem at hand. So you need to identify reasonable alternatives. So many decisions are to be made based on scale, type, location and details. So so EIA team works out to ensure inclusion of environmental criteria for alternatives, and this also consideration for alternatives also starts at a very initial stage, even before EIA. It starts at a very initial stage, but then that starts mostly with the economic aspects, about the functioning aspect of it. So number of broad type of alternatives which are considered, like while looking at the alternatives. So you have one option which is no action option. So you look at that, if nothing is done, if no development project comes, so that's the no action option. So what's really happening? Then you have alternative location, then you have alternative scale of the project, or you can have alternative process or equipments. Then you can have alternative site layout and alternative operating conditions and alternative ways of dealing with the environmental impact. So you can see that what happens with or without project, or if you see alternative, like if the project is done in this location compared to the other location, or if you see that project is done with a smaller size, if we can serve the same purpose with a smaller size with lesser impact, then what will happen, and then what if you change the process, or you have a better design, or you change the layout of the project, or you change the conditions under which it works. And this way, these are the general broad types of alternatives which are considered. So you see that no action or business as usual option is like sometimes considered to be mandatory, and when this is taken, then it also justifies that whatever project is being undertaken is required project, and all the alternatives have been considered for that. So that's about the alternatives, and now we look at the comparison of alternatives. How do we really compare and assess the alternatives? So the impact and cost of alternatives also varies with different groups of people and different environmental components. And so when you discuss with, when you have a consultative process, so many of the alternatives will go out from the process itself. They would not be included. So that would save your time. So you can have the local perspective on which alternatives have to be considered. And it is quite you may not expect that whichever alternative comes up will be acceptable by all the parties here. So that usually doesn't happen. And you really need to have reasonable number of realistic alternatives to undertake, because it's intensive work and that should support your decision making. So there are methods for reviewing your alternatives and comparing your alternatives. So those include methods for comparing and presenting alternatives. They can be non-quantitative. They can be descriptive in nature. Then you can have quantitative modeling, so you can have numbers in all the alternatives and you can quantitatively explain which one is better. And then you can also have overlay maps where you can undertake the analysis and then show which one, where you have better results. Then you can also have models which can quantify the different impacts that different alternatives would have. So you can also use checklist, or less complex matrix also can be used to communicate this. So using all these techniques you can compare. And then you would also be required to explain why you chose one alternative over the other. So in this section of your report, you have to justify all your alternatives, why certain alternatives have been taken and why certain alternatives have been not taken. And you may think about a range of projects, like a mining project has to be closer to the resource, and then the highway project has to depend a lot on the engineering details of it. So there will be a lot of limitation on how many alternatives they can try. So now moving on, we will see project development actions and then the project dimensions. So in a report, EIA report, you are required to give the project dimensions in detail. So a project has many dimensions, like for what the project is being done, what will be the life cycle of the project, 60 years, 70 years, 100 years or so, and then what will be the physical presence of the project, what will be the process involved, what will be the under which policy context it has been done, and what are the related policies with that project. So there are directives, legislation which tells like what kind of descriptions have to be given for particular projects. So European EIA directive gives like gives guidance on like there should be a description of the location, there should be description of the physical characteristic, there should be description of main characteristic of the operational phase of the project, And then there should be estimate by type and quantity of expected residues, what kind of waste and emissions will be generated from the project. So that all has to be given in the description of the project. And in Indian context, you have all these sectorial manuals which gives you details on how you have to provide the project descriptions. So you show various physical characteristics, then you show socioeconomic characteristics, which may include labor requirement, provision of other housing, direct services, flow of expenditure, and so on. And then you also need to look at how you're going to present this data in a very systematic manner, and what all information you will be able to gather and then communicate. Now moving on to the baseline study. So here in this particular segment, you have to establish an environmental baseline. So you have general consideration in the baseline. So here you can use both the present and likely no project future scenario also. So you have to give what is the environmental status currently and what will happen in future with project or no project. So those kind of information has to be given. And you need to look like while you give those information, like for example, it is quite possible that without your project also the environmental quality is degrading. So you can give like what is existingly happening, like what is happening with the current, what's the forestation status, what's the fish status in the lake, what's the water quality in the local environment, and so on. So that can be given. So your initial study may cover wide range of environmental, social and economic variables. So all those have to be taken care of. And you may also refer to all the sectorial manuals given by the MOE FCC. So you can see that for what kind of baseline studies have to be covered. So when you undertake these baseline study, you have certain source of data. So you have like secondary data or hard data which can be taken from the agencies, and then you have soft data which you can do by the primary surveys and all. So it's advisable that hard data which is collected from the secondary sources as per this is much more reliable and easy to communicate. So you have a lot of information sources, like you can use census, you can have other environmental accounts, transport statistics, public health profiles. All these can be used, and then local authority may also provide a lot of information in this. And as a professional, you might have to present this data in variety of ways. So you can have like all these range of data can be presented. And usually you will see that the maps are used, which are not necessary, but maps are very well to communicate. So you can also use GIS, Geographic Information System maps for communicating your baseline environmental status and what would really happen with or without project. So that was about the baseline, and we're going to, in the impact section, we are going to look at how to undertake those baseline studies. So now looking at the impact identification. So impact identification is like in the initial stage, you really find out what kind of impact would happen and in the project. So you look at that aspect, and then there are and with that basic impact, you would try to find out what are the positive impact, what are the negative impact. And there are methods which are available to check the impact, such as like the checklist methods, matrices method, quantitative methods, network overlay maps. So you can here just look at these, like we will cover them in detail later. But then there can be simple checklist which helps you to understand what kind of like to see whether those impacts will happen or not. And then you have matrices matrix to see and to communicate what kind of impact you're going to see at the initial stage. Then you also have network and causal chain analysis which can be undertaken. You can look at the diagram here. And then you can have overlay maps over the GIS. So you can see the maps here. So you need to carefully choose different methods, and you can use combination of methods for impact assessments. So summarizing, so that's all for this session. So summarizing, in this session we had looked at the initial stage of EIA process, and we looked at the management aspect, and then we looked at the screening aspect, and how did we take care of the scoping and baseline studies, and then eventually how the impact identification is done. So that was the coverage of this particular session. This was our key reference for this, and there are suggested watch and read and all the sectorial manuals also you can see for the purpose. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about any concerns you have. Do share your opinions, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring AIA. Thank you.